The word that broke Reagan Moore was not delivered from a judge's bench or hissed by opposing counsel. It wasn't a verdict or a judgment. It was a whisper, fragile as a spider's thread, and it came from her own daughter. Reagan stood frozen. Halfway through a curt, efficient nod to the receptionist at Blackwood Preparatory Academy. Her hand was already reaching for her car keys, her mind already in the conference room for her 4 p.m. deposition. The entire world for Reagan was a series of objectives to be conquered. Picking up her daughter was just one of them. Then the receptionist, a young woman named Chloe with perpetually startled eyes, leaned forward. It was the strangest thing, Ms. Moore. We all know Ivy. Well, but she just said something to Mr. Blake. The name didn't register. Reagan's focus sharpened, her legal mind processing a deviation from the established facts. The primary fact of her life for the last 358 days was that her 7-year-old daughter, Ivy, did not speak. Not to her mother, not to her teachers, not to the legion of therapists whose invoices were as staggering as their failures. What did you just say? Reagan's voice was low, stripped of all warmth. It was the voice she used to dismantle a hostile witness. Chloe shrank back. I mean, she was whispering. We weren't sure at first, but she definitely said something to him. To whom? Reagan demanded, stepping closer to the desk, her trench coat rustling with sharp authority. To Mr. Blake, Chloe repeated, her own voice dropping to a whisper as if sharing a state secret. The janitor, the word hung in the opulent, sun-drenched air of the lobby. The janitor. Everything about Blackwood Academy screamed prestige. The polished marble floors, the hushed corridors, the ancestral portraits of forgotten donors. In this world of quiet, generational wealth, a janitor was meant to be invisible, a ghost who erased the daily smudges of privilege. And her daughter, her selectively mute, profoundly withdrawn daughter, was apparently confiding in him. Her 4 p.m. deposition vanished from her mind. A new objective took its place. Fierce and absolute, she strode down the hall, her heels clicking a staccato rhythm of disbelief and fury. She found them outside classroom 2B. Through the narrow glass pane in the door, she saw the scene. There was Ivy, a pale, ethereal figure in a blue dress, her blonde curls tucked behind one ear. She was sitting cross-legged on a brightly colored reading mat, leaning slightly toward a tall man in gray overalls who was crouched down to her level. His back was to the door, but Reagan could see the focused stillness in his posture. Reagan pushed the door open just enough to hear. Ivy's voice, a sound she had yearned for, prayed for, was a soft murmur. See you tomorrow. The janitor smiled. It wasn't a patronizing, adult-to-child smile. It held a kind of gentle certainty, a shared understanding. I'll be right here, Ivy. Reagan stood frozen in the doorway, a tidal wave of emotions crashing within her. Shock, rage, and a deep, aching jealousy that felt like a physical wound. She hadn't heard Ivy speak in almost a year. But this man, this stranger with rough hands and worn-out boots, had unlocked her daughter's voice with simple, quiet promise. She pushed the door fully open, the wood hitting the stopper with a sharp thud. Ivy, get your things. "We're leaving." The girl startled as if waking from a dream. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing her small unicorn backpack and clutching the strap like a lifeline. The janitor stood too. He was tall, perhaps in his late 30s, with slightly messy brown hair and eyes that seemed to hold a deep, weary calm. He didn't smile at Reagan, just offered a small, respectful nod. "You must be her mother," he said, his voice even. Reagan's gaze was ice. "And you're the janitor who's been conducting unlicensed speech therapy sessions." A flicker of something, pain maybe, or profound weariness, passed over his eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "I don't think anything, ma'am. I was just listening." "Well," she said, her tone crisp and dismissive, "I'd appreciate it if, in the future, you left the listening to professionals we'd pay for that privilege." Ivy tugged lightly at her mother's coat, a desperate, silent plea. "Mom." The whisper, a second time, shot straight to Reagan's heart. It was a plea for her, from her own daughter, but she couldn't let it show. Emotion was a liability, a weakness she couldn't afford. "Not here. Not now. We're leaving," she repeated, her voice unyielding. They walked in suffocating silence through the parking lot, Ivy's small footsteps trying to match Reagan's long, purposeful strides. She unlocked the luxury sedan with a sharp beep, and Ivy climbed into the buttery leather seat. Without a word, her small body swallowed by its opulence. Reagan started the engine, the powerful hum filling the void, but she didn't pull out. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, so tightly her knuckles were white. Her daughter had spoken twice to a stranger, and Reagan had no idea why. It was a case she couldn't analyze, a puzzle she couldn't solve, and the lack of control was terrifying. That night, the minimalist condo overlooking the city felt less like a home and more like a pristine, empty museum. The silence was different now. It was no longer just the absence of Ivy's voice. It was filled with the echo of it, a voice she had heard but hadn't earned. Reagan poured a glass of expensive red wine, the deep crimson a stark contrast to the white marble of her kitchen island. She opened her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keys before typing with grim determination. Gabriel Blake, Bellhurst Academy staff. The school website was a dead end. No photo, just a name under the facility's management roster. It was an intentional wall of anonymity. But Reagan Moore didn't become one of the city's most feared litigators by giving up at the first wall. Her legal instincts, honed by years of digging into the lives of her opponents, took over. She narrowed her search, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Cross-referencing databases she paid a small fortune to access. Gabriel Blake, therapist, New York. One link, buried on the third page of results, stood out. It was an archived PDF from an old medical journal dated 5 years ago. Innovative approaches to pediatric trauma and selective mutism. A case study by Gabriel Blake, MS, CCCSLP. Her eyes scanned the abstract. He'd once been a licensed, board-certified speech-language pathologist. Not just any pathologist, a leader in his field, specializing in pediatric trauma. There were mentions of multiple awards, published papers, keynote speeches at prestigious conferences. He was a star. Then, for years ago, it all stopped. His license became inactive. His thriving practice was listed as permanently closed. No obituary, no scandal she could unearth, no disciplinary action. He had simply vanished from the professional world. And now, he was mopping floors and fixing fountains at her daughter's elite private school. The question wasn't just who he was, but why he had chosen to become a ghost. The next morning, Reagan canceled her first 2 meetings. She arrived at Blackwood just before lunch, her tailored suit a suit of armor, her expression a mask of cold inquiry. She found him in the main courtyard, kneeling beside a large, ornate water fountain with a wrench in his hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Mr. Blake," she called out, her voice echoing slightly in the open space. He stood slowly, wiping his greasy hands on a rag tucked into his belt. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "Ms. Moore." "I looked you up," she said bluntly, dispensing with pleasantries. "You were a speech therapist. A very good one, apparently. So why are you scrubbing fountains at a prep school?" He didn't flinch at the accusation in her tone. He simply gazed at the fountain, at the way the water danced in the sunlight. "I like quiet places." "That's not an answer," she snapped. He finally turned to look at her, and for the first time, she saw the profound depth in his eyes. It wasn't just calmness. It was a stillness born from weathering a storm she couldn't imagine. He gave a soft breath of a laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor. "Maybe I've already given all the answers I had to give. Now I just listen." She crossed her arms, a familiar defensive posture. "Listen, Mr. Blake." "Gabe," he interrupted gently. "My name's Gabe." There was no arrogance in his tone, no agenda. It was just a simple statement of fact, grounded and steady. She hated how much it disarmed her. She pressed on, refusing to be sidetracked. "Did you know my daughter hadn't spoken to anyone in nearly a year?" "I figured as much," he said. "She carries her silence around like a heavy blanket. But a few weeks ago, I was fixing a loose tile near the music room. She would just stand in the doorway and hum, barely audible. So I sat there. I didn't say a word. I just worked. The next day, she sat a little closer. And a few days after that, she came right up to me and whispered, 'Do you like stories?'" Reagan blinked, the information hitting her like a physical blow. "That's how it started? So simple?" That's what she said to you first," she asked, her own voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, and I said yes. A long, heavy pause stretched between them, filled with everything Reagan couldn't bring herself to ask. Then Gabe added quietly, his voice laced with an empathy that felt like an indictment of her own failures. "Sometimes kids don't stop speaking because they're broken, Ms. Moore. They stop because no one is really listening to the silence." Reagan's jaw clenched, a familiar surge of anger rising to masked pain. "You have no idea what she's been through, what we've been through." "You're right," he said, meeting her eyes without an ounce of pity, only understanding. "I don't, but I know what silence sounds like when it's not a choice." Reagan stood there, stranded on an emotional precipice, unsure whether to argue or to cry. She did neither. She turned, her armor firmly back in place. "Stay away from her." But even as she walked away, her confident stride feeling like performance, her daughter's voice, so soft, so real, echoed in her memory. "See you tomorrow." And for the first time in her meticulously controlled life, Reagan Moore wasn't sure whether she was walking away from a threat or from the only miracle she might ever be offered. The following days were a study in controlled chaos for Reagan. In the courtroom, she was a predator, dismantling the opposition's case with surgical precision. Her voice was her weapon, and she wielded it flawlessly. But at home, that same voice failed her. The silence in her apartment was now an active, breathing entity, mocking her professional prowess. She tried to talk to Ivy, forcing a casual tone that felt utterly fake. "Did you have a good day at school, sweetie? Did you play with your friends?" Ivy would just nod, her eyes fixed on her plate, her small shoulders tense. Every unanswered question felt like a fresh failure. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was a judgment. One evening, desperate for a breakthrough, she cornered her assistant, Jenna, a cheerful young woman whose desk was a shrine to her 2 toddlers. "Jenna, you have kids. What do you do when they won't talk to you?" Jenna looked up from a pile of documents, surprised. "Well, with Leo, if he's upset, I just sit with him. I don't push. Sometimes we just build with his blocks for an hour without saying a word. Eventually, he just starts talking when he's ready." "Why?" "No reason," Reagan said, waving a dismissive hand. The simplicity of the advice felt both insulting and impossible. Just sit with him. Reagan didn't just sit. She acted. She strategized. She solved. That night, she found herself back on her laptop, her glass of wine untouched. This time, she wasn't just searching for Gabe's professional history. She was looking for a ghost. She found a link to a 5-year-old video from a national conference on pediatric mental health. The title was "Restoring Lost Voices, Rewiring Silence After Trauma." She clicked it. The image that froze on her screen was of a younger Gabe, clean-shaven, wearing a smart black blazer, his posture radiating a confidence that was now replaced by a quiet weariness. He looked like the kind of man you trust with your deepest fears. She played the video. His voice was warm, articulate, passionate. He spoke about children's silences not as deficits, but as powerful, protective languages. But it was a quote pinned in the comments section below the video, something he'd apparently said during the Q&A that stopped her heart. When a child stops speaking, we are so quick to ask what's wrong with them. The better question is, what is their silence trying to say? Reagan leaned back, her eyes stinging. She didn't know whether she wanted to throw her laptop against the wall or find this man and thank him. He was dismantling her entire approach to her daughter's pain, not with judgment, but with a wisdom that came from a place she couldn't comprehend. Driven by an impulse she didn't understand, she made another call to Blackwood, this time to a contact on the school's legal advisory board, a man who owed her a favor. She lied smoothly. "It's a compliance matter. I need to review the unredacted employment file. for a Gabriel Elias Blake. 10 minutes later, the PDF landed in her inbox. She scrolled past his education. Columbia University, a Master of Science in Communication Sciences and Disorders. She scrolled past his glowing references from his time at Mount Sinai Children's Hospital. She stopped at the reason for his voluntary resignation, personal bereavement, and then the final devastating piece of the puzzle. The name listed under his emergency contact and as the subject of his bereavement leave. Malene Blake, spouse, deceased. Her heart dropped. There was no scandal, no professional burnout. He hadn't just walked away. He had been shattered. That night, Reagan made grilled cheese sandwiches, the one food Ivy always finished. They ate in front of the living room window. The city skyline a glittering, indifferent witness. Did you see Mr. Blake today? Reagan asked, her voice softer than usual. Ivy nodded, her eyes fixed on the distant lights. Did he say anything to you? A long pause. Then, so softly Reagan almost missed it, Ivy whispered. He said silence is like a blanket, but you can still get cold if no one's under with you. Reagan froze, the sandwich halfway to her mouth. She looked at her daughter, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person with a rich, secret inner world. You think he's right? She asked, her voice cracking slightly. Ivy turned to face her for the first time all evening. I think he doesn't talk to fill the quiet, she said, her words chosen with immense care. He just sits in it. That's nicer. I wish I had done that, Reagan thought, the regret a physical ache in her chest. She had filled their home with the noise of her own anxiety, her frantic attempts to fix things, leaving no space for Ivy's quiet grief. The following day, Reagan returned to Blackwood unannounced. She found Gabe in a small supply closet, meticulously organizing mop heads as if they were surgical instruments. You keep showing up in my daughter's words, she said from the doorway. He smiled faintly without looking up. So I guess we're even. Is this another interrogation, Ms. Moore? He asked, finally turning to face her. She held up her phone. No, this time I did my homework. His smile faded. You read my file. It wasn't a question. I did, she said softly. I know you lost her. I know you stopped practicing. And I know you didn't stop listening. He leaned against a metal shelf, the fight seeming to drain out of him, replaced by a deep, resonant sadness. That's all I could keep doing. You said something once, Reagan said, stepping into the small, cluttered space. That silence isn't brokenness, it's protection. You were talking about Ivy, but you were also talking about yourself, weren't you? Gabe's silence was answer enough. I'm sorry, she said quietly, for your wife, and for what I said to you, for assuming you were just a janitor. He offered no bitterness in his voice, only a weary acceptance. You weren't wrong. I am a janitor. And it's the first job I've ever had where no one expects me to fix something I can't. Reagan stepped closer. The scent of bleach and old would fill in the space between them. "But you're fixing something," she whispered. "Not just Ivy. Maybe me too." He studied her then, his gaze gentle but piercing. Ivy didn't need fixing. She just needed someone who remembered what it's like to lose their own voice. Reagan swallowed the lump in her throat. "And you," she asked, "what did you need?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I needed to matter without having to save anyone." The silence that followed was no longer heavy or awkward. It was safe. It was a shared space. Then Gabe added, almost to himself, "You know what the last thing my wife wrote to me was?" On her little whiteboard. Reagan shook her head. She wrote, "You hear what other people miss. Don't let grief make you go deaf." And for a long time, I did. Reagan stepped back, choosing her next words with the care of a closing argument. "Would you ever consider doing it again? Therapy, not for a fee, just for Ivy, for the ones who whisper?" He studied her for a long, thoughtful moment. A quiet battle seemed to rage behind his eyes. Then he looked at her, really looked at her, and a decision settled. "Only if someone sits with me this time." She smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. "I'm here." And for the first time, so was he. Their sessions weren't sessions at all. They were moments, stolen in the quiet corners of the school. They met in the dusty, forgotten music room. There were no forms to fill out, no diagnostic codes, no clinical distance. Just Reagan, Gabe, and Ivy. Ivy had found an old, out-of-tune upright piano. Her fingers, small and hesitant, would press one key at a time, not playing a song, but searching for a melody that lived only in her memory. "Each note is like a word, Ivy," Gabe said, sitting beside her on the worn bench. "You don't have to rush it. Just feel what it wants to say." Reagan sat on a nearby chair, watching. For once, she didn't analyze. She didn't take mental notes. She didn't try to steer the outcome. She just listened. She listened to the imperfect notes, to the long pauses between them, and to the quiet, steady rhythm of her own breathing. Something inside her, coiled tight for years, began to exhale. The change in her was subtle at first. She started leaving the office at 5. She stopped bringing her work home. One evening, she found an old, dusty box in a closet. Inside was a Bluetooth speaker she hadn't touched since the divorce, and a small, antique music box that had belonged to her mother. She wound it slowly. A fragile, high-pitched melody trickled out. Ivy came running from her room, her eyes wide. "That's it. That's the song." "What song, sweetie?" "The one I was trying to play on the piano. The one Grandma used to play when you read me bedtime stories." Reagan knelt, tears stinging her eyes as she pulled her daughter into a hug. "I didn't know you still remembered that sound." Ivy looked at her mother for a long, quiet moment. "I remember everything," she said. The progress wasn't linear. There were days of silence, moments of frustration, but the foundation had shifted. Their home was no longer a silent battlefield. It was becoming a safe harbor. The outside world, however, was not so understanding. Rumors began to circulate at Blackwood. Whispers in the carpool line concerned emails to the administration. The sight of the school's most enigmatic student spending so much time with a janitor was, for many parents, an unnerving breach of protocol. The inevitable summons came. Reagan was called to a meeting with the Parent Advisory Board. She walked into the library, where they sat around a long, polished table, their expressions a mixture of polite concern and thinly veiled judgment. Ms. Moore began the board chair, a woman named Mrs. Callahan who wore her pearl necklace like a badge of honor. We've received several concerns about the unorthodox relationship between your daughter and Mr. Blake. Reagan folded her arms, her courtroom demeanor snapping back into place. Is there a complaint from my daughter? Well, no, but... From her teachers? From the principal? From anyone who has actually witnessed their interactions? The room fell uncomfortably quiet. It's about optics, Ms. Moore. A man at the end of the table finally said, "This school has standards." Reagan leaned forward, her voice low and lethal. Then let me tell you about standards. My standard for my daughter's well-being was not being met by any of the world-class professionals I hired. My daughter was disappearing into a silence none of you could penetrate. This man, this janitor, didn't offer a diagnosis or a treatment plan. He offered her his quiet, patient presence. And in that space, she felt safe enough to find her voice again. You want to talk about risk? The real risk was letting her fade away. And you want to remove the one person who prevented that because of optics. Just then, the library door opened. A frantic secretary leaned in and whispered something to Mrs. Callahan. There's been an incident in the Commons. 2 students. I believe your daughter is involved. Reagan's blood ran cold. She was on her feet instantly. The hallway was a scene of controlled chaos. Students were gathered in a circle, whispering. Reagan pushed through and saw her. Ivy was standing beside another girl who was holding her cheek and crying. Ivy's hands were clenched. Her face was pale, but she was not silent. I said, "Stop." Ivy's voice was loud, clear, and shaking with righteous anger. You pushed my book off the table. I asked you to stop 3 times. You thought it was funny. It wasn't. The principal stepped forward, but Reagan was already there, crouching beside her daughter, her hand a steady presence on her shoulder. I heard you, Ivy, Reagan said, her voice filled with a pride so fierce it almost choked her. Every word. Ivy's eyes, wild and powerful, met hers. He didn't listen, she whispered, her lip trembling. So I had to make him hear me. Reagan pulled her into a hug, burying her face in her daughter's hair. I'm so proud of you. Back in the library, the atmosphere had shifted. I believe this changes things, Mrs. Callahan said stiffly. No, Reagan said, her voice ringing with newfound clarity. "This reveals things." Ivy didn't just speak. She advocated for herself. Because someone finally gave her the permission to believe her voice was worth hearing. If you remove Gabe Blake from this school, you're not just firing a janitor. You are sending a message to every quiet child here that their voice doesn't matter unless it's convenient. So make your choice, but know exactly who you are choosing not to listen to. She walked out without waiting for a reply. Ivy's small hand held firmly in hers. That evening, a tentative peace settled over their apartment. Gabe came to dinner. It was clumsy and casual and perfect. He didn't sit at the table like a guest. He sat like he belonged there. Ivy chattered, telling him about a raccoon she'd seen, and he listened with the focused attention he gave everything. After Ivy was in bed, Reagan walked him to the door. "She asked me today if I was happy," Reagan confessed into quiet of the hallway, "and I didn't know what to say." Gabe nodded, waiting. "But I realized something tonight," she continued, her voice soft. "I used to think happiness was an achievement, a verdict in my favor. Now, I think it's just about choosing to be with people who feel like a silence you don't need to fill." He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that lit up his tired eyes. "And do I feel like that kind of silence?" Reagan met his gaze, her answer clear and unwavering. "You are that kind of silence." As he stepped out into the cool night air, she called after him, "Gabe!" He turned. "If I asked you to try again, not as a therapist, but as a man, would you?" He paused, the weight of the question settling around him. Then a slow, certain nod. "Only if you promise not to try and fix me." "I won't," she whispered. "Then yes." He walked into the night, not away from a past he couldn't change, but toward a future he was finally ready to build. Upstairs, Ivy lay awake, watching the city lights flicker. She whispered into the darkness, "Please let this be real." And from the hallway, her mother's voice answered back, soft and steady, "It already is." The following spring, Blackwood Academy officially launched a Story Through Sound pilot program. It wasn't run by a licensed therapist, but by a janitor and his 7-year-old assistant. In a small, sunlit room, Gabe and Ivy sat on the floor with a small group of children. The quiet ones, the anxious ones, the ones who usually faded into the background. There was no agenda, no pressure. They just played with old instruments, told stories, and listened. Reagan often sat in the back, not as a lawyer or a board member, but just as a mother, witnessing the quiet, steady work of healing. The end-of-year ceremony took place in the grand auditorium. The final speaker of the evening was not the principal or a distinguished guest. It was Ivy Moore. She stepped up to the podium, a tiny figure in the bright spotlight. The room fell silent. She found her mother in the front row, and Gabe standing in the wings, his encouraging smile a beacon. She unfolded a crinkled piece of paper. "Hi, I'm Ivy," she began, her voice small but clear, amplified by the microphone. "I used to be quiet, Not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't know if anyone wanted to hear it. Then someone did. He was a janitor. He didn't ask me to speak. He just stayed, and that made me want to. She took a breath, her gaze finding her mother. My mom is here, too. She's a lawyer. For a while, I thought she only listened in courtrooms. But now, she listens in the car and at bedtime and in the quiet. And sometimes, when she doesn't know what to say, she just holds my hand. That's even better. I learned that voices are like music. Some are loud and some are soft. Some don't come out for a very long time. But when they do, they deserve a place to land. Thank you to Mr. Gabe for giving my voice a place to land. And thank you to my mom for giving it a place to grow. She finished, her last words hanging in the still air. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the applause began. It wasn't thunderous. It was slow, reverent, and full. She ran off the stage, straight into Gabe's arms, and then was enveloped by her mother's. "You didn't just speak, sweetheart," Reagan whispered, her tears finally falling freely. "You moved an entire room." Ivy looked up at the two of them, her expression serious. "Can we get pancakes now?" Gabe laughed, a full, happy sound. Now that's a proper ending. They walked out into the warm summer air together. The lawyer who had learned to be present, the girl who had found her voice, and the janitor who had discovered that healing wasn't about fixing what was broken, but about listening to what remained. They were a strange, unlikely trio, a story written in the spaces between words, a melody composed of both silence and sound. And as they walked toward the car, hand in hand, they knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.